Robust conversation with our colleague from Wisconsin.
It's been good.
All right.
Thank you.
So, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Corinth, and I'd like to start with you. In your testimony, you raised concerns with the validity of studies from the National Academy of Sciences and the Census Bureau touting the effectiveness of morphing the child tax credit into a child allowance. You also challenge the various studies that claim impressive results from the American Rescue Plan Act's changes to the credit, and particularly its impact on child poverty. Now, it's a lot to unpack, I realize, but could you expand on these issues, specifically outline the flaws or data gaps in each of these studies? And then, in addition, you note that you did your own simulation of what impact shifting the child tax credit into child allowance would have on employment and poverty. Could you perhaps tell us a little bit about your findings as well as respond to arguments that your concerns are overstated?
Thank you. So quickly, the first study was the National Academy of Sciences study, and there it's very simple. They failed to recognize that the child tax credit's work incentive was eliminated. When we fixed the error and applied all their other assumptions, you get 1.3 million people leaving the workforce. In terms of the 2021 studies, one of the problems is that lots of things were changing at the same time. So not only did we get the child allowance, we also had child care assistance being extended. We had vaccines being rolled out, schools opening up again. So it's very hard to isolate the effect of the child allowance as opposed to these other factors. And the other issue, of course, which I mentioned in my testimony, is that when you have a temporary 6-month policy change, it's going to be a lot different than how people would respond to a permanent change. And then finally, in terms of the study that my co-authors and I did, we were the first study to actually recognize and model the work incentive effects of this policy change. We also used by far the highest quality data set. We linked survey data with administrative tax records and government program data to get much more accurate incomes and to identify those people who were most likely to respond to the incentives. So when we used that higher quality data and actually recognized the work incentive changes, that's when we find that 1.5 million people would leave the workforce.
So, as you know, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that Congress passed in 2017 doubled that maximum child tax credit amount to $2,000, allowed most of it to continue to being refundable for those with sufficient earnings up to an inflation-adjusted cap, which is currently around $1,600. Under current law, this increased child tax credit will be cut in half if Congress does enact. So could you please speak to the importance of the child tax credit as it's currently structured and the benefit that it's providing to American families today?
Sure. So the existing child tax credit sort of has a triple bottom line. It encourages work, reduces poverty, and invests in the long-run success of children. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did a lot more than that. It boosted economic growth, increasing wages across the spectrum. So I would say it's vitally important to make that permanent after 2025 when it'll otherwise expire.
Dr. Rashidi, in your testimony, you speak to how the American Rescue Plan temporarily revamped the child tax credit, and one of the changes that it made was paying it directly to individuals without any taxable income, thereby removing the historic incentive for credit beneficiaries to be working and turning it into, as we've talked about, a child allowance. Should the American Rescue Plan version of the child tax credit be resurrected, could you speak to some of the negative impacts, including impacts on workforce participation, that you would expect to see among those claiming the CTC?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I do have concerns both about making it fully refundable for non-working households as well as eliminating the phase-in, which has the work incentive that Kevin is talking about. For the non-working families, I have concerns for a couple of reasons. One is we have a large body of evidence from the 90s, and I agree we're not in the 1990s, but I also don't want to return to the 1990s. And so the making the child tax credit available available to non-working families would actually be a larger benefit to those non-working families than AFDC was in the 90s, and we know that that had very bad effects for families. And so I'm concerned about that. The other thing I'm concerned about for non-working families is currently we have a fairly robust social service system for those families in terms of SNAP, TANF, other benefits. When you turn that into a child allowance, it removes a touch point from the social service sector, and I have concerns about what's happening in households when there's no work in the household, and just kind of removing that touch point is concerning, I think, from a child perspective.
Well, and just to follow up on that, you pointed out in your testimony that there are these other federal programs that do not have a work requirement component and are therefore targeted at helping those who are unable to be employed for one reason or another. So could you just enumerate again or outline for this committee what some of those federal programs are and why paying the child tax credit to those without taxable income duplicates these other efforts and reduces the effectiveness of the child tax credit?
It very much duplicates this existing system that we have. We currently have temporary assistance for needy families, which is primarily targeted to non-working, mostly single mother families. It provides child care assistance, provides a lot of other support services. We have SNAP, which is formerly food stamps, also available to non-working families. So there's a fairly robust safety net that already exists for non-working families. So that's why a CTC with the phase-in, with the work incentives, that's only available to working families is such a positive policy because it encourages that work and it gives those non-working families the incentive to get into the labor market to provide them not only the opportunity to escape poverty, but also that employment will help them move up the income ladder.
So you referenced in your testimony this Penn-Wharton budget model that reviewed the American Rescue Plan CTC changes, and it found that the benefits of the changes are not targeted at those families in the lowest income brackets. So could you speak, or if you could, broadly at least, to those distributional effects of the American Rescue Plan CTC changes on families in various income brackets, as well as the distributional effects of the advance payment specifically? I think there's an impression here that those changes did impact or distributed among people with lower incomes, families with lower incomes, and I'm curious as to what you have seen, while that was in effect, and maybe can speak to the distributional impacts of that change that was in place temporarily.
Yes, it's a good question. I mean, because the expansion of the child tax credit was so large and reached so high up the income scale, it was neither strictly an anti-poverty policy nor was it tax relief. It was kind of a mix of both. So if you think of the expanded child tax credit as necessary to reduce child poverty, it really isn't targeted well towards child poverty because the Penn-Wharton model and even the data that we have on what families received the benefit, less than 50% was actually targeted in terms of expenditures, targeted to the bottom 2 quintiles of income, which means middle and higher income families got about half of those benefits. But that's a design choice. I think the perception is that because it was made fully refundable and went to non-working families, it was strictly an anti-poverty policy and most of those benefits went to those households, but in reality, it was much more distributed across the income spectrum, and like I said, not really truly tax relief, but also not strictly an anti-poverty policy.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would say simply in conclusion that in my state of South Dakota right now, the unemployment rate is, if you can believe this, under 2%. And if, in fact, what you're saying in your analysis, Dr. Corinth, is accurate, and that is that we're going to lose, it's going to cost us over 1 million people who aren't going to go back into the workforce. We need people in the workforce. And if it's also true that, as Dr. Rashidi has pointed out, that the distributional effects of this do skew toward the upper end as well as to people in the lower income categories, it perhaps is keeping a number of people out of the workforce. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Thune. I'm going to defer to Senator Warren because she's here and it's her turn. But I would say, that Dr. Rashidi's testimony, I think, confirms what's reality about the child tax credit, which is that It both is an anti-poverty measure and a measure targeted at America's middle class, and that's why you see the distribution. You know, unlike the Trump tax cuts, which I'll go through in a second after Senator Warren, where 52% of the benefit went to the top 5% of Americans. As Dr. Rashidi said, the 50%, just over 50% of the tax credit that we put in place in 2021 went to the bottom 50% of Americans. That's true, and that was the design. So America, it does consistent choices, and we're going to have to make choices about whether we want to cut taxes for the wealthiest people in America again and expect it to trickle down to everybody else, or whether for once we're actually going to do something for working people and for people living in poverty. Senator, do you have something to respond? Do you want anything to say?
Well, no, I would just say...
Because I don't want to leave
I think
you
the
hanging.
only thing I would say to that is if you look at, again, and of course, it's surely when people are paying more, as a total, in totality, you're going to see more tax benefits, probably when I'm talking about volume, but when you're talking about percentages, what happened with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017 is, in fact, if you look at who pays taxes, the burden, the tax burden, relative to what it was prior to 2017 and after, people with higher incomes ended up paying more, not less.
And I think the question, you and I actually had this debate. I don't know if you remember, but we had it back